Senator Crapo, who has an amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment relates to the Victims of Crime Act and the trust fund that is established under that act. That act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Reagan in October of 1984, and it serves as the central source of federal financial support of direct services to victims of crime through a dedicated funding stream. VOCA is administered at the federal level by the Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, which annually awards grants to each state, the District of Columbia, and our territories. And then these agencies, in turn, subgrant to organizations that provide direct services to victims of crime. The money for these grants, and this is very important, the money in this fund is not taxpayer dollars. The money that goes into this fund comes from penalty assessments, fines, bond forfeitures collected from convicted federal offenders, and other certain collections that come from the criminals, the violators themselves, who pay the fines and penalties that create the dollars in this fund. Those dollars are then used for the victims of these criminals until they get to Congress. And then what we do is we basically just let a little bit of these dollars be used for the victims of crime and take the rest of it and either count it as savings in the budget or spend it. And this amendment will protect that fund from Congress basically using it as an offset to call it savings or using it to funnel money into other federal spending. Now let me give you an example of the kind of victims who receive this critical assistance through VOCA funding. They include children who are victims of physical and sexual assault, victims of accidents involving intoxicated drivers, victims of domestic violence, victims of adult sexual assault, victims of elder abuse, family members of homicide victims, and victims of robbery and assault. And in our society, we have established this fund to protect these victims, and the fund is not being allowed to be used to its fullest extent by Congress because of budgetary gimmicks that are allowing portions of this fund to be shifted elsewhere. In fact, in the year 2000, a cap was put on this fund, and any amounts over the cap were utilized by Congress, frankly, for savings or offsets. Right now, the difference we're talking about is about $1.4 billion of support for victims of crime that could be provided if Congress would stop robbing the fund. And we also found out in 2008 that even the amount that's under the cap that was agreed to that we would allow to be used for victims of crime is not safe, because that year the conferees in the budget or in the appropriations conferences removed another $35 million from the funds and allocated them to other taxpayer programs. Now, Mr. Chairman, what this amendment will do is simply to establish a point of order against using as an offset a limitation on the amount of money in the Crime Victims Fund available to the Office of Victims of Crime at the Department of Justice. It's very simple. If Congress is going to do this, they ought to have to get 60 votes in order to do it, rather than to continue the process that they've followed for so many years now of simply taking the money away from the victims who need it.
I would just say in response, I would resist this amendment. The inclusion of changes in mandatory programs, it's called CHIMPs around here, in appropriations legislation, and the potential for abuse has been a concern of mine, just as the concern that you've given, and it is very legitimate. Your concern is very much on point. When I became chairman, there was no way to control or prevent the inclusion of changes in mandatory programs in an appropriations bill, and there were endless abuses. 2 years ago, I included a new 60-vote point of order in the budget resolution against the practice. Under the point of order, appropriators can include CHIMPs if they're deficit neutral over the 9-year period following the budget year, have no net increase in budget authority over 10 years, or are included in the appropriations bill where there is no net cost of the changes in mandatory programs in the out years. This new point of order includes an exception for changes in mandatory programs that have been included in each of the 3 prior years. This particular element had become a regular feature of the Department of Justice appropriations language prior to the creation of my new point of order. The purpose of the point of order was to prevent the inclusion of new changes in mandatory programs that weren't paid for. I think this is a place where you and I actually have a certain sympathy or a similar position, because it was running amok what appropriators were doing. And that's why I established the new point of order. With respect to your proposal, my staff tells me that if we would adopt it, it could jeopardize the fund's viability in years that collections fall short, and that it perhaps doesn't recognize the new 60-vote point of order that I've already created to try to preclude the abuses that had been occurring.
Well, let me respond.
Final word from Senator Crapo.
Please, thank you for the final. First of all, in terms of depleting the fund can be managed, and the Department of Justice does manage it. And I don't know that the Department of Justice would simply spend out the entire fund in 1 year and then rely in a bad economy on the fund refilling. I think that they could probably be trusted to handle the fund in a way that would avoid us putting ourselves in jeopardy of not being able to refurbish the fund in lean economic times. That being said, in essence, what the point of order you described that you put in requires that an offset be found for the adjustment in this fund. But let's understand, Mr. Chairman, what we're doing here. It's called a change in mandatory spending, but the program, this entire fund, the entire almost $2 billion in this fund, is considered by the CBO at the beginning of the year to be mandatory spending. We then put a cap on that and say, no, we're going to take 2/3 of it and we're going to spend it on other things. And then in order to stop that cap, which is what my amendment is trying to do, if we didn't have my amendment under the point of order you have, in order to stop that cap from causing this result, we have to offset it. So we are being required to go look for taxpayer dollars somewhere in the budget to offset the privilege or the right, what should be a right, to access the very fund that was created for the purposes which we are seeking to lift the cap. My point is that by putting the cap on this fund, we have arbitrarily created a level of funding out of this fund which is called mandatory spending now, and we're being forced to access non-taxpayer dollars with taxpayer offsets, with tax offsets. And it's just wrong, Mr. Chairman. This fund was established for victims of crime. Congress is spending 2/3 of it on other things. And we're being told we can't access it unless we can come back in and find some dollars in the budget elsewhere to offset it. That's not right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And very few of our colleagues were here when I presented this, so I ask you to please listen carefully. I think we all know what the Victims of Crime Act is, and in that act we establish a fund for victims of crime. And that fund is a dedicated fund. These are not taxpayer dollars. The funds that go into the Victims of Crime Act fund come from fines and penalties paid by criminals so that their victims can be helped. These victims are those who are suffering from domestic violence, children who face sexual assault and other battery, and other victims of crime. And you know the safe homes and the different places around our country that provide support for these victims. Why am I bringing the amendment? Congress has gotten into a pattern of denying access to this fund for victims. The fund is now at about $1.9 billion. Congress has put a cap on it for the last few years at about $635 million. And what happens to the other money? I think why Congress does this is because then this extra $1.4 billion or so that's out there is able to be used as offsets for other spending or as some kind of savings in the budget to make the budget numbers look better. And in some cases is actually just taken and spent on other things. And this amendment would provide a point of order that would make it so that this fund is entirely available to the victims of crime. It's administered by the Department of Justice. Now, the chairman said he was going to have to oppose it. He said that the concerns that had been raised to him are that if the fund is made totally available for the Department of Justice to utilize for these purposes, that it could be all spent out and depleted and jeopardized. Frankly, there are statutory controls in place that give the Department of Justice the ability to administer these funds with sensibility. And there's $1.9 billion in the fund right now. Last year, Congress estimated that the funds coming in this year would be another $710 million, and already in 1/3 of this year, it's $640 million that has come in. On top of that, the Department of Justice has announced negotiated criminal fines in 2008 and 2009, totaling another $2.4 billion that will be coming in. This fund is not in jeopardy of being depleted. It's in jeopardy of being robbed. And this amendment should be adopted so that we can stop Congress from denying this fund to the very victims for whom it was created. And again, these are not taxpayer dollars.
Senator Crapo, let me ask you this. I so much agree with the intent of your amendment. The question that I've raised is because professional staff advised me there's a question about jeopardizing the fund's viability. I would like to take your amendment on a voice vote. If we can do a little more research between now and the time we get to the floor, if we'd work together to try to address that concern that's been raised, if you'd be agreeable to do that, I'd be agreeable to taking it on a voice vote.
I would be very agreeable to work with you on that,
okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think you're, yes.
I'd very much like to work with you and Senator Crapo on it. I think Senator Crapo has made a good point, and you have as well, and this is exactly the kind of way we ought to legislate.
All right. Senator Corn.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to be added as a co-sponsor to Senator Crapo's
Without objection.
amendment.
Senator Sessions, co-sponsor as well, without objection. Senator Merkley? Senator Merkley is a co-sponsor as well. Acceptable to Senator Crapo. Senator Crapo, thank you. We'll take this on a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to. Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator